Hello and welcome back to part 2 of 2020's design retrospective. It has been a little bit since I recorded the first half of this particular series of videos. Originally I wanted to get both parts of the retrospective recorded and uploaded before the end of 2020, but it took a little bit longer to schedule a recording session in between everything else I'm working on. As a result, the first part for the two-dimensional designs went up at the beginning of January, and this one is being recorded at the end of January and will hopefully go up before the end of the month. But to sort of jump back into everything that we're doing here, just like we did for the two-dimensional designs, this is the Pixel Sprite version of the retrospective. And what I've done, just like the last video, is I have selected 20 samples from content posted throughout 2020, and I'd like to run through and just talk a little bit about some of the ones that I found were noteworthy or that I had something to say regarding, and hopefully this will be a little bit more of a streamlined video. I will try not to ramble and will try to condense down the discussion as much as possible. So let's go ahead and jump into the first design. We'll be going in chronological order from content posted in January all the way up through, I believe, December of 2020. First on the list, this particular design was posted on January 1st, first of the year, January 1st of 2020, and this sprite is called Invasive Kisai Harian. And looking back over the content for the Pixel Sprite series that I've worked on, every once in a while, I like returning to the idea of these sort of plant creatures, very much inspired by old school 16-bit RPG enemies and stuff like that. That's how you get the design you see here with this sort of main body and a flower-like enclosure with the quote-unquote head of the plant creature up top being connected via these roots or tentacles. And I've done a lot of variations on this kind of concealed plant creature idea. For some reason it's something I keep coming back to, and it's usually a pretty good challenge of mixing up themes and coloring. I do like the mix of bright shades on this one. Bright and dark shades give it a sort of poisonous look, which seems pretty fitting for a plant creature. Can't remember if this one was added to our Redbubble store as a design. I need to sit down and put together another package of sprite designs that I want to put onto our store. We'll go ahead and move on. Next up, we have a design posted on February 19th of 2020. The selected designs will vary from a few to a single entry per month for a total of 20. But this one is called Core VS01 Cerise. And this is another entry in the Eternus Core Mecha designs, Pixel Sprites that I've been working on for... This is the second year, I think? This series started last year. I'd have to go back and look. But to recap real quickly, because I do want to talk about the respective series that some of these designs come from. The Eternus Core Mecha series is, as the name would suggest, based around mechanical or mecha-inspired creatures. They tend to be a mix of bipedal, or some have different lower bodies, but inspired by things like classic mecha from anime, or things like Eva or Gurren Lagann. Stuff like that. I've taken some sort of themes and put together these mech creatures, and this particular series is noteworthy, like I've talked about in the past, because it's a modular series. So what I mean by that, real quickly, just to recap, in case you haven't seen my older videos where I talked about this series, each mecha piece here, which is put into this sort of blueprint schematic template, so I could label all the different parts like you'd see on a blueprint. Each design is created in sections. So the head, the body or core, the arms, the legs, the lower body, and whatnot, they're all created on separate layers in Photoshop when I draw the pixel sprites. And when I put them all together, I put them into one folder directory and I layer them to get the design you see here. But the modular system allows me to take these, and I don't think I've posted any alternate sprites in the series yet. I should do that, maybe on weekends or something, to keep the content posts over on DeviantArt going. But the modular components allow me to mix and match the different designs. So I could take this particular one, the core unit of the Cerise model, and import in arms from a different unit, a head from a different unit. Same with the lower body and legs. And as a result, I can mix and match and create all sorts of different permutations of these mecha creatures. And my intention was to post the mix and match models as alternates, so I'll have to think about when I want to do that. I've been putting that off for a while. But overall, the mecha series is a pretty interesting experiment. I usually try and come back to it frequently when I'm doing things like the design streams and whatnot, just so I can get ideas together and experiment around with new ideas and or mix and match to create new models. So this is the first one posted February 4, 2020. Next up, we have a design posted for March. This was posted on March 18th of 2020, moving in the middle of the month. And this one is Triburner Argelos. And this particular one is part of a family of sprite designs that I believe made an appearance last year. I'd have to go back and look at the archives for 2019's retrospective. But this particular series is composed of these flyer type creatures with wings and sort of a long serpentine body. And what I did for this series, since I made 4 different elemental versions of these sprites, is I took different parts of the design, be it the head shape, the eye shape, tongue, body, wings, or even color patterning, and I edited the features of each alternate palette. So the base body and design is the same, but each elemental variety or variation in the series has different attributes that set them apart. And that's something I tend to do every once in a while with these sprites. Taking a page from old school RPG monster design, I will take the base, create the image, and if I feel like experimenting around with the themes or attributes, I will copy that into a new folder and then redraw different parts of the sprite to give it some distinct features and then recolor it and reshade it. And this is the fire element version of the series, which I believe is posted 2 or 3 of the different variations. But overall, I do like switching things up every once in a while and trying to come up with some design variations, sort of akin to subspecies design. And I guess we'll see if there's any more from series that are like that. There may be a couple that I selected for the sample in 2020. What I'll do is I'll call that out if we get to another one of those. But we can go ahead and move on. Well, looks like they'll be talking about that sooner than later. This one was posted on April 15th of 2020, and this design is called Zapping Bolttail Yavri. And this particular creature is a bipedal bird-like creature, only has 2 legs, no arms, has a long segmented tail with a sort of bolt-like appendage or extension on the end. And like the last one that we saw before, this particular one was also part of a variation series. What I did for this one, and I think I've posted another one in the series, but I don't think it was selected for a video. For the variations, I edited parts of the head, the beak, and the body, and the tail specifically on the different elemental variations to set them apart. And I believe it was... this one was lightning. The counterpart variations would have been ice, light, and shadow element variations. So each one of them has some features that set it apart from this particular one, and they'll be mixed into the rotation for content in the future. But again, following the idea of subtle variations or design element changes for alternate sprites is something I do find interesting. I don't do it a ton, but it just depends on the design. We'll go ahead and... This one from April 22nd of 2020. This one is called Freezing Star Akari. And this is the first quote-unquote dragon type design featured in the sample of work from 2020 so far. And this one has a pretty typical long body style of a dragon. I guess if we were to compare it to something I know, like Monster Hunter, this would be a Leviathan body type, where it's a little bit more serpent-like, doesn't have wings, but being an ice element creature, this particular one has a sort of Arctic blue coloring with these darker blue stripes and these long fins on its head and tail. Overall, I do like experimenting and trying different design ideas for the dragon type creatures. They tend to be larger sprites, and they take up a lot of the standard sprite template canvas that I use. I think you can see that a little bit in this one, which is something I noticed after I put the renders together for these. This one looks like it ran out of space, and the reason why you can tell is because if you follow the path of the body, the tail is sort of wrapped around and bent inwards a little bit more than I think I would like if I was going to do it over again. If the canvas was maybe a third larger, then I could have had enough room to give more of a rounded curve and loop to the tail, so it doesn't look like it's sort of bent inwards just for the sake of not running out of space. The standard canvas that I use is pretty set for these sprites. Some of the other design series, which we'll talk to more specifically later, utilize a bigger canvas. So it's always a juggling act when it comes to figuring out, do I want to try the design on something small? If I know it's going to be big, do I want to try and just pull over the template for the larger resolution canvas so I don't run out of space? But overall, it doesn't really cause too many problems. And aside from the tail being a little bit more compact, I think this one turned out alright. It's a fairly large sprite, but has a lot of detail and stands out pretty well amongst some of the other ones. Moving up, we are skipping a couple months ahead. Looks like I didn't select any from the sample in May. This one was posted on June 8th of 2020. And this design is called Tundra Eye Tracker Hivranum. And this particular design, this particular sprite, rather, was from a series of elemental creatures that had a lot of canine features. I believe I selected the debut sprite from that series for the last retrospective. It was the Helmhound looking one with the sort of gold-plated helmet and light color scheme. What I did, just like the previous couple we saw for the variations, is I took the base shape, this quadrupedal stance, and I picked some elements to edit from a color standpoint or from an overall design element standpoint. In this case, I changed the shape of the head, and instead of two eyes, I gave it one sort of jewel looking eye in the middle, and then the back, I gave it a sort of fin type body part here. And overall, I think this one reflects its ice element fairly well. I went with a mix of blues to give it the sort of polar Arctic look, but I contrasted that with some purples just to give it some variation. The hands and claws, I believe, are unedited from the original one. But overall, it seems like this one does stand out when compared to its quote-unquote cousins. And I do like the sort of pose that ended up here. It does make it look like a very dog-like position. I can't remember if any of the other alternates made it in the sample. We'll have to see. I've done 3 that I've posted so far, I believe. But we will go ahead and move on to the next one in the series. We're already halfway through the year, and not too deep into the recording. So maybe this particular retrospective video will be a bit quicker than the two-dimensional design one. Next up, we have another design from June of 2020. This one was posted on June 17th. And this one is the Gildon family. And I think this may be the only one of the multi-family sprite design sets that I picked, but we'll have to see. And to recap a little bit on what this means, when I work on the families or family sprite sets, I will take a page from things like your Pokemon series, most notably, where you have a base form for the creature and then two other quote-unquote evolved forms within the same family or lineage and same element. This is a stone element family of creatures, and the idea of this, again inspired by things like Pokemon, would be to take design elements from the different stages and build upon them while adding in new ones until you get to the last phase of the evolution, where everything sort of comes together for the final creature. And for the Gildon family, and I don't have the names of the individual ones handy here, the original DeviantArt post would have that. So if you're curious as to what these are called in each phase, I would check there. But the first phase is this small, kind of diminutive looking creature, and it has sort of metallic looking claws and a basic yellow/gold color scheme. In its second form, it becomes a bit more bipedal and develops sort of gold armor on its body and claws. And the final form is much larger, has pretty well developed forelimbs, and the gold plating extends all the way up to its shoulders and makes it look like armored gauntlets. And the plating along its head and back and torso are much more armor-like. And overall, this particular series was a challenge to work on, since I knew I wanted to end up going for a larger, more developed version of the initial design. And I think once I hit the second evolutionary phase here, I knew I wanted to build on this idea of the gold armor. And in the end, this larger sprite, and this one took up almost the entire canvas if I remember, the end result ended up carrying a lot of those themes through. I do think this one looks fairly neat. It's almost kaiju-esque in its design. And compared to some of the other family ones, it does stand out. So overall, the creature family sprite sets, I need to make a point to do more often, because they force me to do things like stay on model when it comes to specific elements or design elements specifically that I want to pass through each form. And I don't know if the Pokemon designers create their multi-step evolutions the same way, but I really wanted to sort of try and take that idea and make some unique creatures out of it. So that's why I tend to return to this format every once in a while. It's a good challenge and usually has some interesting. Moving on, we are entering the month of July. This one was posted on July 1st of 2020, and this one is called Electrocuting Octopus Vazaldron. And interestingly enough, remembering back to the post history, this particular design was part of a multiple step evolution series, kind of like the last one, except it only had two phases. And when there's only two quote-unquote evolutionary phases, I don't tend to put them into the family format like you see here with the different steps all in one image. Usually if it's just two, I'll post them separately. But this one started off as a sort of eyeball looking tentacle creature, and the second or more evolved form builds on that a little bit by giving it a more pronounced body and these large tendrils that are connected, kind of a mix of mechanical and organic elements, this being a lightning element creature. overall, this one reminds me a lot of the tentacle type creatures you see in old school RPGs or video games, which is sort of the idea here. I wanted to create something that looked like it could be mechanical, well, or naturally occurring just based on its body shape. And I don't think this is the only time we're going to see these sort of unusual looking creatures in the sample. I think I might have selected at least. But overall, I think this one turned out decently. The color scheme is a bit noteworthy in that it doesn't really scream a lightning elemental creature when you look at it. And I did make it a point to kind of give myself an unofficial rule that I'm not bound to quote-unquote stereotypical colors when I make these. If it's a fire element creature, it doesn't necessarily have to be red. In line with that, if it's a lightning element creature, it doesn't have to be a mix of yellows. It's pretty subjective, and I choose the color palettes, one, based on what I think makes sense for the design, and also looking back at previous posted designs, I try not to duplicate color palettes. That's a challenge I run into on a lot of my design work in general, is coming up with a somewhat distinct mix of colors so it doesn't look like I'm just copy-pasting a paint job from something else. That tends to be one of the larger challenges, in addition to coming up with names for all these things that I make. We'll go ahead and move on. Next up, we are still in the month of July. This one was posted on July 15th of 2020, and this one is called Geistblade Gantoth. And this particular one, a shadow element creature, is a bit more unique compared to some of the other ones in that this is kind of a haunted or ethereal creature. The design that I was going for with this one would be sort of like a disembodied cape with a helmet and a weapon being wielded, sort of like a ghost type creature. The crystalline core inside, it's hard to tell because of the depth rendering here, but the core would be floating free sort of within this cloak, and be a creature that has no real visible body but is able to manipulate its weapon, the sword, like a poltergeist would. And overall, this particular style or creature type I don't tend to work with a lot. I do think the idea of ghost creatures are interesting, and this one is most likely influenced by creatures like the galley species from Monster Rancher. I think that's a pretty direct line of influence if you were to look up the concept art for those. But being I love the Monster Rancher series, it's not too surprising that creatures from that universe and their design elements tend to influence some of the things that I draw sometimes. But overall, this one turned out alright. I did do some alternate color palettes for this one to reflect different elements, and playing around with the things like the color patterning on the outside and inside of the cape, in addition to the helm and the weapons, yielded some interesting results. Overall, I think these particular ethereal type creatures I need to make a point to revisit every once in a while when I run out of ideas, just to play around with the different concepts and create something different. Okay, we are wrapping up the month of July of 2020. This one was posted on July 22nd. We have another entry in the Eternus Core Mecha series, and this one is model NVS01 Tirnaga. And like I mentioned for the Cerise model we saw earlier on in the video, the different attributes for these mecha creatures is not necessarily set in a hard and fast template when it comes to bipedal creatures versus other variations. This is the first one to have a serpentine body, though. The idea for this one, which is where it got its name, is that unlike the two-legged bipedal entries in the series, this one has a sort of segmented serpentine lower body that allows it to move differently. The arms and other attributes sort of take a page out of standard Naga or I guess Lamia type creature lore. And I thought that would be interesting to translate over to a mecha type design. I know this is not a completely unique concept. You see stuff like this in mecha media. But it was a good experiment, and having this particular body type as a customizable component when making alternates also yields interesting results, since slapping this particular body type on a different type of central body and limbs does make things look a little bit different. And given this one was snake-like, I felt like a base green color scheme with some lighter highlights and purple spikes or claws lent itself well to that particular style. I would like to see what other types of non-standard mecha variations for body parts can come out of that whole process. So we'll see. Next up, we are moving into the month of August, starting in the middle of the month. This one was posted on August 19th of 2020. And this one is the sprite for the creature Gemini Titan. And I chose this one for the sample because it marked the debut of a new sprite series that I started working on in, I believe, 2020. I'd have to go back and look, but seeing as how this was the first one posted, I'm pretty sure it started then. But this sprite series is based on creatures from the mobile game Jurassic World Alive. And I've talked about it previously due to doing some designs, but to real quickly recap what that is, Jurassic World Alive is similar to Pokemon Go. It's an AR exploration and creature catching and training type game, but unlike Go, which I haven't played for a while, mostly due to the fact that we're still under quarantine and can't leave our homes and go out exploring easily, Jurassic World Alive focuses a bit more on the competitive side with its mechanics. The idea of raising these different dinosaur creatures and their hybrids to battle other people online is a central part of the gameplay, and is one of the things that I find the most interesting when it comes to building teams around metas and competing with other people online. And one of the reasons why I've been playing this game so long compared to Go is that the social feature is a lot more prominent. I mentioned it last time we talked about it, but I am part of the Reddit Alliance, which is part of the game's social mechanics, where you join an alliance and you and your other alliance mates sort of cooperate and get some in-game benefits for unlocking things. And it also makes it easier to coordinate for the raid system, which was introduced last year, I believe. The raids, which I don't think are going to be relevant to anything I selected for this year, but raids, like in any other game, are multiplayer event instances that happen throughout the week, and they tend to be very difficult for the upper tier creatures and require specific teams, coordination, and a bit more setup than just going and spamming buttons. So being part of the Reddit Alliance and the Reddit Discord group, which if any of the folks from the Reddit Alliance see these videos, I like to shout out the folks there. They're a good group of people, and it's been fun jumping on for co-op raids with everybody. And I think that has probably kept me engaged with the game more than something like Go, just because there's a bit more to do. But this design is from that game, and to get back on track here, Gemini Titan is a large, long-necked hybrid and possesses a bunch of attributes from its components that give it immunity. I'm not going to go into the gameplay specific things with these creatures, but I will say that for the Sprite series, when I decided to do more fan art for Jurassic World Alive and start creating the different creatures in this Sprite format, I wanted to create a template that was going to be a bit more unique compared to some of the other fan art stuff I've done. So for each of the entries, we'll have a sprite for the creature itself, as close to on model from the in-game version as possible. But I also created a two-dimensional emblem in Rhino, which is the other portion of my work that I do, and pair these together for the template. So in addition to just the sprite, you're also seeing a two-dimensional emblem rendering of the creature. So for Gemini Titan, it's got a very unusual color pattern. It's sort of a dark gray blue, depending on which lighting scheme you're looking at and which official artwork you're looking at. But it has a red light color patterning along its neck and on its face, and its arms are blue, which come from one of its components. And it has these sort of spikes and hair-like things along its neck as well. Overall, it's a pretty cool hybrid. The ones that we're going to see here are selected primarily because they're from the PvP team that I use in-game. So the ones that we'll see in the sample, I believe, are all from that. But eventually, as I post these, I will be branching out into other hybrids that I don't necessarily use, but I do like from a design perspective. So that's sort of the premise behind the JWA fan art stuff, which started up in 2020. I believe we'll see at least one other sample. We can go ahead and move on. Next up, we're moving into September, middle of the month. This one was posted on September 16th of 2020, and this one is called Golden Slasher Yiram. And this particular creature, again, taking a page out of RPG or video game monster bestiaries, is a bipedal creature with these large clawed arms, and its upper body is protected by this sort of shell-like plating. And there's not a whole lot to say about this one. It is a bit more unique compared to some of the other ones, but it seems like it would be right at home in either a platformer or an RPG type game. The color scheme I went with here, a mix of yellows and purples, was meant to sort of adhere to the idea that this was a lightning element creature. I don't think I've explained the legend behind the elemental symbols in this series, but I've talked about it in other videos, and I'll try and call it out just so it's clear, but this is the lightning element, or lightning elemental symbol, to denote the elemental affinity for different things. So overall, this is not too complicated of a design, but it did seem a bit more unique compared to some of the other sprites, which is why I selected it for the sample. Next up, we are wrapping up the month of September of 2020. This was posted on September 23rd. And this one is Dimensional Tyrant Volkezin. And this particular design also takes a page from RPG boss lore. But one thing that set this design apart from others, and is why I selected it for the sample here, is the shading. This one was an experiment in multiple layers of color, just to see how the effect would translate to the design itself. And what I did was I used Photoshop and the area selection tools to take this main flame-like shape for its body and add in individual layers of slightly darker or lighter shades to give the design a bit more of a 3D or depth. And I haven't done that with any other designs besides this one. So this particular one has a lot of color and a lot of shades to it. Overall, I think the effect is pretty noteworthy. This one, even if you zoom way out from the image, which I can't really do here, but it does make it look like this whole thing is sort of glowing, which was the intent behind the design. So I think playing around with the shades in Photoshop and trying this sort of additional level of detail, something I want to do more of. This one was kind of the guinea pig and trial. So overall, it's something I think I need to do more, just to mix up things like the color variation and things like the shading. Sort of sort of tie all that together before I move on, the Sprite series, since it started, has always been single level shading. And by that I mean the sprite itself only has one shade. I think at some point I want to start experimenting with multiple shades on all of the designs. This particular one only has it on the fire pattern here. But I think doing things like having a darker tone and a mid-tone shading level would make the designs appear a bit more complex. It is more work, but I may experiment around with that idea more in the future and just see what happens. Next up, we are at the final design for September. This one was posted on September 30th of 2020, and this is another Jurassic World Alive design sprite for the creature Thorodolosaur. And I'm pretty sure for the previous retrospective I had selected the two-dimensional emblem design I did for this creature. Prior to starting up the Sprite fan art series, I had done a few of these two-dimensional designs for the full body render of the creature. And at the time when I did this one, this particular creature was still on my PvP team, and that's why I ended up posting it. But Thorodolosaur is a mix of Allosaurus and Sinoceratops attributes and Tarbosaurus DNA. Overall, this still remains one of my favorite hybrids in the upper end of the meta. From a design perspective and also from a functionality perspective, I do like Thor a lot. It's designed to be sort of a high damage chomper type for piercing armor, and overall has had a real interesting track record in the meta. They've sort of buffed and nerfed and rebuffed this particular creature, but it was part of my older arena PvP team, so that's why it was posted. It's not on my team now because I've swapped it in for some other things, swapped it out. But I do like its mix of colors. The in-game model, again, which has a bit of variation depending on how the lighting works, but its body is a mix of these greens and sort of seafoam shades and these more neutral undertones. But it's also got this bright sort of teal patterning on it, which I like. Overall, drawing these dinosaurs is also a good experiment in practicing poses. I can't really get too wild and crazy with the poses for these dinosaurs on a limited resolution canvas. Again, this particular series is on a larger base canvas than the other designs we've seen so far. And that's primarily to give myself some room to work so I don't, run out of space. But overall, I enjoy working on these. And I think playing Jurassic World Alive as long as I have is sort of reminding me why I like dinosaurs so much. Something I grew up with, and it's kind of fun to be able to attempt to do fan art pieces based around things from that particular series. So we'll go ahead and move on. We're going to jump ahead to the later part of October. This one was posted on October 21st of 2020. And this is Sinking Octopod Tenebris. And I think I mentioned this in the content post when I put this one up on DA. But this particular design, being a sort of 8-legged octopus-like creature, I think was primarily inspired by Ultros from Final Fantasy VI. The fairly reoccurring antagonist character in that game was also a large 8-legged octopus-like creature. It had some more unique design elements, but it had a lot of personality. So when I was working on this one, I feel like that sort of leaked into the design a little bit. The pose and this sort of crown shape thing on its head give it a bit more of a unique identity, but I definitely think the whole genesis of this idea was driven by the mischievous octopus of Final Fantasy lore. Moving along, we're getting towards the tail end of the sample here. This one was posted on November 4th of 2020, and this one is Core UBTX-01, the Prong Whip. And like the other entries in the Eternus Core Mecha series that we've seen so far, this one has a couple unique features, which is why I chose it for the sample here. Going back to the bipedal creature layout, this one has got sort of these larger, stocky legs, but its arms are these long, sort of bladed tentacles, hence its name. And when I was designing this one, it started off as a pretty standard model, but when I got to the arms, I wanted to try something a little bit different. And looking back at the design history, this might have been one of the first entries where the arms weren't just standard regular arms and hands. And that's something I've tried to remind myself to do as I work on these. Again, it's based on a template, which I demonstrated when I did a live commentary video on drawing these a year or two ago now. But the standard template doesn't mean I have to necessarily follow a standard formula whenever I'm drawing these. So if I get a weird idea like tentacle arms, then it's pretty easy to take that template and adapt it to create something unique. And overall, I do think the sort of lighter, almost pastel looking color scheme contrasts with the fact that it's a weird tentacle creature. And this particular set of limbs has yielded some interesting results in the variations. So overall, I feel like this one was a bit more of a unique entry in the Mecha series for 2020, which is why I chose it here. Next up, we are moving into the middle of November. This one was posted on November 18th of 2020. And this one is Soaring Immolation Valsyrix, a fire element creature. This one I chose because this is the first one in the sample that was a sprite based on a previously posted design. And I'm fairly sure I selected the design this one was based off of for previous retrospective video. I don't remember off the top of my head. But before this one was a sprite, it was a two-dimensional circular design from the Elemental Circular series. And as I was thinking of ideas of things to draw in sprite form, I got the idea to take things from that circular series and try and translate them here. So this sort of fire-based winged bird with a long tentacle tail was based on that original two-dimensional design concept, and obviously simplified a lot more for sprite version, but this sort of kicked off the idea of moving between media formats that I've talked about before, taking designs in one medium and then trying to recreate it faithfully on model in another medium. It's something I plan on doing more in the future, and some of the designs in that circular series are very complex and very unusual looking. So it will be interesting to see how they translate over to the sprite side. And vice versa. I think in the two-dimensional retrospective for 2020, I had one design from earlier on that was a sprite first, and then I made it a two-dimensional design. So this result here is going in the opposite direction. So we'll definitely be seeing more of that in the next year or so. Next up, we are leaving the month of November soon. This one was posted on November 25th of 2020. This is, I believe, the final Jurassic World Alive sprite in the sample. And this one is called Magnipirador. And Magnipirador is one of my favorite designs. I think this might be my second favorite of the unique class hybrids after Thor from a design perspective. And to real quickly recap where this one gets its design elements from, Magna is a mix of a raptor-like creature called Piratator, I think it's its name. I haven't actually looked up its name in a while. And it combines that with Dimetrodon attributes for its unique form. And as a result, it's quadrupedal. It has sort of a stocky body, and the Dimetrodon elements show up in the form of this red finned sail along its back, which is, to me, one of the most noteworthy things. The Piratator attributes that it has sort of show up in the pink parts, which are actually feathers. It's very difficult to show the texturing at this sort of resolution for this design, but the tail and the parts on its arms are actually feathered bits. But Magna is pretty neat. It's a creature that functions sort of like a jack of all trades with a bunch of status immunities and the ability to inflict debuffs, and it's pretty speedy if you build its stats correctly. But overall, I just thought its design was pretty unique, and it is actually still a mainstay dinosaur on my PvP team. And it was pretty high up on the list of ones to prioritize when it came to creating the Pixel Sprites. So that's why I chose it here. Overall, it's a pretty neat creature. The coloring is tricky on this one. It's got a lot of bright colors on it, and its main body is sort of this off maroon, off purple. But when I did the two-dimensional design, it ended up being a bit more brown. Again, the tricky thing about viewing the models for this game is that the lighting kind of determines what they look like, so I have to kind of guess when I'm working on these. I come up with my best guess as far as which color palette's going to be on model. To me, the sprite is a bit more on model than the two-dimensional design, but I think it still sort of carries through in the end, so you can tell what it is. I don't think anyone would mistake this particular design for another entry in the series. But overall, Magna is a cool creature. I like it a lot. Next up, we are entering the month of December. I think this might be the last one on the list, maybe one more. This one was posted on December 17th of 2020 for the year end. And this one is Horrific Globe Kindrail. And this design, going back to the idea of tentacle creatures and otherworldly monster type designs, this one, I think, represents a lot of the sort of Lovecraftian inspired or just weird type creatures that I tend to draw every once in a while, in sprite format and in any other format, really. It almost looks, based on the texturing, like it's a tentacle-filled basketball, which wasn't necessarily my intent. I started with a base circle shape that I drew in Photoshop, then I created the outline from that, and I guess the main theme was ball with tentacles, because that's what ended up being the final result. But it is an unsettling creature, and I do like the way the sort of slime texturing on its appendages turned out. This is more an experiment in layering, color layering, and I think it creates an interesting effect. I don't know if this is standard for normal sprites, but the idea that I can stick textured bits on a different layer and show that it's still part of the model is good flexibility to have when creating these. The end goal is create something weird, and I think this one was fairly successful there. Looks like we are at the end of the sample. I don't have an end card, but overall, there was a lot of work posted in 2020 for the Sprite series. Like I've mentioned in previous videos, I post these every Wednesday over on DA, and I alternate between the established series and then just random ones. I do still enjoy working on the Pixel Sprites a lot. It's a good break from the two-dimensional stuff, which I primarily do. And it's always a unique challenge, no matter which sprite series I'm working on, to come up with something unique. And with things like the theme series, the mecha, or things like the Jurassic World Alive dinosaur sprites, there's no shortage of content for me to try and adapt into sprite format. So I do plan on continuing to do this for the foreseeable future, and I've been thinking a bit about some more themed projects to work on. It's possible we'll see that later on in 2021. If I decide to debut a new series, then I will make a note to talk about that in the roundup for the year. But other than that, I think that will do it for this particular entry in the retrospective series. Once again, if you're watching this over on YouTube, I would like to thank you for checking out my work and listening to me talk about the process behind some of these weird things that I make. But that'll do it for this particular session. Thanks again, and I will see you guys in the next video.